The forest had been dead for 300 years. That's what the old maps said, anyway. Back when cartographers still dared to chart the Valewood's borders, back when humanity still believed it could understand the dark places of the world through ink and parchment. But standing here now, boots sinking into soil that felt more like ash than earth, Cale Thorne knew the maps were wrong. The forest wasn't dead. It was waiting. Above him, the canopy twisted into impossible geometries, branches that defied the natural order of growth, reaching toward a sky they would never touch. The moon hung there like a judge's gavel, cold, blue, merciless. Its light didn't illuminate so much as expose, stripping away comfortable shadows and revealing the Valewood for what it truly was, a scar across the world where reality had grown thin. Cale's breath misted in the frigid air, each exhalation a small ghost that dissipated into the darkness. His hand rested on the hilt of his weapon, a blade that hummed with a frequency just below human hearing. A sword forged in the weapons labs of the Radiant Dominion before their fall. Plasma-edged, neural-linked, capable of cutting through vampire bone like morning mist. He'd killed 17 of them with this blade, 17 monsters who'd strayed too close to human settlements, who'd forgotten that even apex predators could be hunted. The sword's name was Dawnbreaker, though Cale rarely saw dawn anymore.
He'd been tracking the vampire warpack for 6 days, following a trail of slaughtered villages and drained livestock across the Ashmark territories. 6 days of broken bodies and silent screams frozen in the faces of the dead. 6 days of failure, always arriving too late, always finding nothing but aftermath. Until tonight. The distress beacon had pulsed across his neural implant 3 hours ago, a Dominion military frequency that shouldn't have existed anymore, not since the vampires had torn through the last human strongholds like paper. But there it was, weak and desperate, calling out from the heart of the Valewood, where no human had any business being. 3 signals. Juvenile. Terrified. Cale had almost ignored it, probably a trap, almost certainly a trap. The vampires were old, clever, patient. They knew humans responded to cries for help the way moths responded to flame. But something in the signal's desperation had hooked into his chest and pulled. Maybe it was the exhaustion, the 6 days of chasing ghosts and finding corpses. Maybe it was the memory of his sister's face, pale and still, drained of everything that had made her her. Maybe he was just tired of running toward death and arriving too late to make a difference. So he came. The Valewood swallowed him whole, and for 3 hours he'd navigated by the beacon's pulse, descending deeper into a forest that grew stranger with every step. Trees that bled sap like mercury, fungi that glowed with bioluminescent script in languages that predated human civilization, the ruins of something ancient and vast, stone architecture that suggested the vampires hadn't been the first inhuman things to claim this darkness. And then, in a clearing, where the moonlight fell like a spotlight on a stage, he found them. 3 girls. Children. Cale's first instinct was to raise Dawnbreaker, let its plasma edge flare to life. End this quickly. Because they weren't human. That much was immediately, viscerally clear. Their skin held that particular pallor that came from never seeing sunlight. Not the tanless complexion of someone who worked indoors, but the actual absence of melanin, of blood flow, of warmth. Like porcelain given shape and breath. Their eyes caught the moonlight and threw it back in shades of crimson, not the red of normal human blood vessels, but deeper, richer, the color of wine aged in darkness for centuries.
Vampires. Young ones, but vampires nonetheless. He should have killed them instantly. But they were huddled together beneath a collapsed stone archway, arms wrapped around each other, and the expressions on their faces weren't the predatory calculation he'd seen in every vampire he'd ever hunted. They were terrified. The tallest of the three, maybe 14 in human years, though with vampires it was impossible to tell, had silver hair that cascaded past her shoulders like moonlight made tangible. She wore the tattered remains of what had once been an elaborate dress, all dark velvet and intricate embroidery, now torn and stained with something that might have been blood, or ash, or both. Her arms were wrapped protectively around the other two, and when she saw Cale emerge from the tree line, her eyes went wide with a fear so raw it was almost human. "Please," she whispered, and her voice carried an accent Cale couldn't place, something ancient and aristocratic. "Please, we mean no harm. We're not—" She couldn't finish the sentence. The girl to her left, younger, with black hair cut asymmetrically short and wearing the remains of what looked like a military uniform, completed it in a voice barely above a whisper. "We're not like the others." The third girl said nothing. She was the smallest, perhaps 10 or 11, with hair that somehow managed to be both silver and black, braided with small bones and what might have been jewels or might have been crystallized tears. Her eyes were the most unsettling, not just crimson, but layered, depths within depths, like looking into a well that went down forever. Cale kept Dawnbreaker raised, its energy field casting sharp shadows across the clearing. "You activated a Dominion distress beacon. How?" The silver-haired girl, the leader clearly, exchanged glances with her companions. "We found it, in the ruins. We didn't know what it was, but we hoped it might call someone who could help us." "Help you?" Cale's laugh was cold. "You're vampires. I'm human. You know how this story ends." "We're children," the black-haired girl snapped, and there was actual fury in her voice, bright and hot and desperate. "We didn't ask to be born this way. We didn't ask for any of this." "What are you running from?" Cale demanded. Because they were definitely running. That much was obvious from the fear in their postures, the way they kept glancing over their shoulders at the darkness behind them. The silver-haired girl swallowed. When she spoke, her voice trembled. "Our mother." And that's when the temperature dropped 20 degrees in an instant. The moonlight flickered. Not like clouds passing overhead, but like something had stepped between the moon and the earth. Something vast enough to cast a shadow across reality itself. The ruins around them began to weep. Not metaphorically, actual tears of blood seeped from the stone, running down ancient carvings in rivulets that defied gravity, flowing upward instead of down. And Cale understood, with the sick certainty of someone who'd spent too long hunting monsters, exactly what was coming. "How long?" he asked quietly. "She's been tracking us for 3 days," the silver-haired girl whispered. "We can't run anymore. We're too weak. We haven't—" She glanced at Cale, then away, shame coloring her pale features. "We haven't fed." The black-haired girl grabbed her sister's arm. "Seraphine, we can't ask him to—" "I know." Seraphine, so that was her name, met Cale's eyes with something that might have been dignity or might have been surrender. "I know what we are. I know what you are. But please, if there's any mercy in you, make it quick. Don't let her take us back." The forest around them began to sing. It wasn't a sound that human ears were meant to process. It existed on frequencies that bypassed hearing entirely and went straight into the brainstem, the lizard brain, the part of human consciousness that remembered being prey. It was a song of dominion, of absolute power, of hunger refined into art form. Cale had heard it once before, during the fall of the Radiant Dominion, when the Vampire Queen herself had led the assault on humanity's last fortress. He'd been a soldier then, barely 20, armed with weapons humanity had spent decades developing specifically to fight the undead. He'd watched those weapons fail. He'd watched his entire battalion torn apart in 11 minutes. He'd survived by hiding beneath corpses for 3 days while the vampires feasted above him. The song was getting closer. Cale looked at the 3 girls huddled together beneath their archway, preparing to die. He looked at Dawnbreaker, its plasma edge still humming with lethal potential. He thought about his sister, about the 17 vampires he'd killed, about the 6 days of chasing death across scorched earth, and he made a decision that would echo across centuries. He deactivated Dawnbreaker. "Get behind me," he said quietly. Seraphine stared at him. "What?" "I said, get behind me, all 3 of you, now." "You can't," the black-haired girl started. "I can't kill the Vampire Queen," Cale agreed, "but I can buy you time to run, so move now." The smallest girl spoke for the first time, her voice carrying harmonics that made Cale's teeth ache. "Why would you protect us?" Cale didn't have a good answer to that. Or maybe he had too many answers, all of them tangled together, vengeance and mercy, exhaustion and spite. The memory of his sister's face and the look of terror in Seraphine's eyes that was far too human for something that shouldn't be human at all.
"Because I'm tired," he said finally, "of arriving too late." The 3 princesses, and he understood now that's what they were, daughters of the night's absolute sovereign, scrambled behind him, pressing themselves against his back. He could feel them trembling, could smell something like cinnamon and grave flowers, could sense the desperate control they were exerting not to respond to the pulse of his carotid artery. And then she arrived. Later, when Cale tried to describe that moment, he would struggle to find words that didn't sound like madness or poetry or both. The Vampire Queen didn't walk into the clearing. She manifested, as if reality itself had bent to accommodate her presence. One moment there was only darkness and singing stone and the cold moon overhead. The next moment, she was there, and the world reorganized itself around her like iron filings around a magnet. She was impossibly tall, 7 feet at least, though height seemed almost beside the point when you existed on the scale she occupied. Her wings spread behind her like a cathedral stained glass rendered in shadow and blood, each feather edge sharp enough to cut moonlight, the membrane between them pulsing with veins that glowed like lava beneath obsidian. Her armor wasn't worn so much as grown, black scales that might have been metal or might have been her own skin, decorated with symbols that hurt to look at directly, script that rewrote itself moment to moment in languages that predated human language. A crown sat on her brow, not placed there, but emerged, as if her skull had decided to grow architecture, bone twisted into impossible geometries that suggested both throne and weapon. But it was her face that truly unmade him. She was beautiful the way a supernova was beautiful. Overwhelming, absolute, the kind of beauty that destroyed the capacity to perceive lesser things. High cheekbones that could have been carved by a master sculptor who spent lifetimes perfecting a single angle. Eyes that burned with the light of dying stars, crimson shot through with gold. Pupils that weren't round but multifaceted, like looking into gems that contained entire universes. Her lips, when they parted, revealed teeth that were more like weapons than biology. Too many of them, too sharp, arranged in patterns that suggested function over form, predation refined over millennia into perfect efficiency. And when she spoke, her voice resonated in the bones of the earth. "Daughters?"
That single word carried weight that made the ruins around them crack. Ancient stone, weathered by centuries, fractured under the pressure of her acknowledgement. Behind Kael, he felt the three princesses press closer together, felt their terror like electricity. "Mother!" Seraphine whispered, and the word was both prayer and condemnation. The queen's eyes moved from her daughters to Kael with the slow inevitability of a falling guillotine. She studied him the way an entomologist might study an interesting insect, with curiosity certainly, but also the absolute knowledge that she could end his existence without effort. "A human," she said, and there might have been amusement in her voice, or might have been something far more dangerous. "A Saphron standing between me and my children, armed with a weapon designed to kill my kind? Activating it would take a single thought, and yet you keep it dormant." She tilted her head, an inhuman gesture that revealed the impossible length of her neck. "Why?"
Kael's mouth was dry. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to fight, to do something other than stand here like a sacrifice on an altar. But he'd made his choice. "They asked for help," he said, and was surprised by how steady his voice sounded. "I came. They are vampires, child of dust and daylight. We killed your kind by the thousands. We ended your civilization in a single night of red rain. We are the darkness at the end of evolution, the proof that your species was always temporary." The queen took a step forward, and the ground beneath her feet withered, grass turning to ash in her wake. "And yet you protect them. Explain." "I don't have to explain anything to you." The words left Kael's mouth before he could stop them, and the clearing went absolutely silent. The queen stared at him. Behind her, the fog thickened, red embers beginning to spiral upward like inverse snow. The temperature dropped so low that Kael's breath turned to ice crystals in his lungs. And then the queen laughed. It was not a comforting sound. It was the sound mountains make when they're being born, rock grinding against rock, the earth's crust cracking under pressure. It was beautiful and terrible, and Kael wanted nothing more than to never hear it again. "No," the queen agreed, "you don't. But you will die nonetheless, small hero. You will die, and I will reclaim my daughters, and the world will continue turning as it always has, indifferent to your brief defiance." She raised one hand, long fingers tipped with claws that looked like crystallized night, and the air around her began to distort, space itself bending toward her palm. Kael activated Dawnbreaker. The blade roared to life, plasma edge flaring brilliant blue-white, a miniature sun in the darkness. Neural links flooded his nervous system with combat algorithms, reaction time enhancers, everything the Dominion's best weapons designers could cram into a single weapon system. It wouldn't be enough, he knew that, but he'd activate it anyway. "Impressive," the queen murmured. "Humanity always did excel at crafting tools to compensate for weakness. But child," her eyes flared brighter, "I am 3,000 years old. I have ended kingdoms. I have drunk the blood of gods. What could you possibly do to stop me?" "I don't have to stop you," Kael said, and launched himself forward. He was fast. Dominion combat enhancements made him faster than any baseline human had a right to be. Dawnbreaker cut through the air in an arc that should have taken her head clean off her shoulders. The queen caught the blade between two fingers, the plasma edge which could cut through reinforced vampire bone, which could slice through 3 feet of steel, stopped dead. The queen held it casually, as if Kale had swung a child's toy at her. "Is that all?" she asked. Then she moved. Kale had fought vampires before. He knew they were fast, but the queen operated on a different order of magnitude entirely. She was suddenly behind him, her hand wrapped around his throat, lifting him off the ground with no visible effort. "You cannot win," she whispered in his ear, her breath cold against his neck. "You cannot even wound me. You are a mayfly challenging a mountain. You are—" "Distraction!" Kale choked out and triggered Dawnbreaker's overload sequence. The sword screamed, its plasma containment field destabilized in a controlled cascade, releasing a week's worth of stored energy in a single microsecond burst. The explosion was small by artillery standards, barely 20 feet in diameter, but the temperature at its core exceeded that of a star's photosphere. The queen shrieked, the first time Kale had heard genuine pain in her voice, and released him. He hit the ground rolling, combat reflexes already directing him back toward where the princesses huddled. "Run!" he shouted at them. "Go! Now!" Seraphine grabbed her sister's hands, but she hesitated, looking back at Kale with something like horror. "You'll die! By no! Go!" The queen rose from the crater where the explosion had thrown her. Her armor was cracked, molten in places, one wing hanging at an angle that suggested broken bones. But she was alive, and as Kale watched, he could see the damage already beginning to repair itself, flesh knitting back together with supernatural speed. Her eyes found Kale, and there was no amusement in them anymore. "You," she said, her voice carrying a weight that made his ears bleed, "have irritated me." She extended both hands, and the earth between them erupted. Massive thorns of crystallized blood burst from the ground, each one as thick as Kale's torso, creating a forest of crimson spears that surged toward him with the speed of striking serpents. He dove, rolled, came up running. A thorn grazed his shoulder, and he felt his entire left arm go numb, some kind of paralytic venom. Another thorn punched through his thigh, and he screamed, stumbled, forced himself to keep moving. Behind him he could hear the princesses fleeing into the forest. Good. That was good. If he died, but they lived, it would be worth— The queen appeared in front of him. There was no transition. She was simply there, blocking his path, intact and terrible and done playing games. "Enough," she said. Her hand plunged into his chest. Kale felt his ribs crack like dry twigs, felt her fingers wrap around his heart, felt the invasion of his body, the violation of space that should have been inviolate. He waited for her to squeeze, to end it, to fulfill the promise of death he'd known was coming since the moment he chose to stand between her and her daughters. But she didn't squeeze. Instead, she leaned close, her face inches from his, those burning eyes boring into his soul. "Why?" she demanded. "You are human. They are vampire. You should hate them. Your species and mine have been at war since before your ancestors climbed down from trees. Every instinct you possess should scream for their death, and yet you protected them. You threw your life away for them. Why?" Kale tried to speak, but blood filled his mouth. The queen's fingers tightened fractionally around his heart, not enough to stop it, just enough to send agony cascading through his entire nervous system, a reminder of her complete control.
"Answer me," she hissed. He swallowed blood, forced words past torn lips. "Because they were afraid." "Fear?" The queen's voice was incredulous. "That's why you sacrificed yourself? Because my daughters were afraid?" Not just afraid." Kale's vision was going gray at the edges, consciousness fleeing. "They were children, terrified, asking for help. And I was
I was tired of arriving too late. His voice failed. His vision went dark. The last thing he heard before unconsciousness took him was the Queen's voice, soft with something that might have been wonder or might have been rage. Extraordinary. Cale awoke to the smell of grave flowers and ancient stone. His first thought was confusion. He should be dead. The vampire queen had her hand inside his chest, had held his heart between her fingers. Death should have followed as naturally as night follows day. His second thought was pain, a deep, systemic agony that suggested his body had been torn apart and put back together by someone who only vaguely understood human anatomy. His third thought was the realization that he was lying on something soft. He opened his eyes. He was in a bed, an actual bed with silk sheets and far too many pillows, in a room that looked like it belonged in a palace from a time when palaces meant something. Vaulted ceilings soared overhead, carved with reliefs depicting scenes from vampire mythology. Hunts beneath blood moons, great wars against things with too many limbs, coronations of queens who ruled when humanity was still learning to make fire. Moonlight fell through a massive window, painting everything in shades of silver and shadow. And standing beside his bed, watching him with crimson eyes, was Seraphine. "You're awake," she said, and there was relief in her voice so profound it bordered on worship. "Thank the old darkness, you're awake! We weren't sure. Mother said you'd probably survive, but she's been wrong before, and—" "Where am I?" Cale's voice was a ruined thing, rough as broken glass. Seraphine winced. "The Eternal Throne, my mother's palace. You've been unconscious for 3 days." 3 days. Cale tried to sit up and immediately regretted it as his entire body screamed protest. Seraphine moved to help him, her hands cold but gentle, propping pillows behind his back with practiced care. "Easy," she murmured. "You're healing, but you're still human. You need time. Your mother? She spared you. I don't understand why. She's never spared a human before. Never. But she brought you back here, had her physicians work on you, gave orders that you were to be treated as a guest." She looked at him with eyes that held centuries of confusion compressed into a teenage face. "What did you say to her in those last moments?" Cale tried to remember. The details were hazy, pain and blood loss erasing specifics. "I told her your fear mattered, that you asked for help, and I came." "That's it?" Seraphine looked almost offended. "That's what stopped the Queen of all Vampires from killing you, because we were scared?" "I think—" Cale hesitated, trying to put instinct into words. "I think she didn't understand why I'd protect you. She needed to know." The door opened. The black-haired girl, Cale still didn't know her name, entered carrying a tray with various bottles and bandages. She stopped when she saw Cale was conscious, and something complicated crossed her face. Relief, yes, but also suspicion, wariness, the kind of careful distrust that came from being hurt too many times. "He's awake," she said flatly. "Great! Does this mean we can finally ask him what his actual plan was?" "Morrigan," Seraphine chided, "he saved our lives." "He tried to kill Mother with a bomb." Morrigan, so that was her name, set the tray down with more force than necessary. "I'm not sure saved is the right word when the rescue plan involves explosive suicide." "I didn't have a plan," Cale admitted. "I just needed to buy you time." "Well, you bought it." Morrigan started checking his bandages with rough efficiency. 3 days' worth, and now you're a guest in the most terrifying place in existence, being kept alive by the personal order of a 3,000-year-old vampire queen who has never, in her entire existence, shown mercy to a human. So congratulations. I'm sure this will all work out great. The smallest princess, the one with the layered eyes, appeared in the doorway like a ghost, silent and sudden. She studied Keol with an intensity that made him profoundly uncomfortable, as if she could see past his skin into the architecture of his thoughts. "He meant it," she said softly, "when he stood between us and Mother. He was willing to die, truly die, not as strategy or sacrifice or noble gesture. He just decided our fear mattered more than his survival." "That's insane," Morrigan muttered, but there was something in her voice that might have been reluctant respect. "That's human," the smallest princess corrected. She moved closer to the bed, her movements carrying an eerie grace. "I'm Lilith. You've met your sisters. Thank you for protecting us. It was foolish and doomed, and we should probably all be dead because of it. But thank you." Keol looked at the three of them. Seraphine with her aristocratic bearing and barely contained desperation, Morgan with her military precision and defensive anger, Lilith with her ancient eyes and child's face. Vampire princesses, daughters of humanity's greatest enemy. Children who'd been terrified enough to activate a distress beacon and pray someone would care. "Why were you running from your mother?" he asked. The three sisters exchanged glances. Some silent communication passed between them, the kind of wordless conversation that came from centuries of sisterhood. Finally, Seraphine spoke. "Because she's dying." The words hung in the air like a pronouncement of doom. "The Vampire Queen?" Keol said slowly. "The immortal sovereign of the night? The being who ended human civilization? She's dying?" "Not in the way you're thinking." Seraphine stood, began pacing, her torn dress whispering against the floor. "Mother is the first vampire, the original. Every other vampire in existence is descended from her blood, carries a fragment of her power. She's sustained by faith and fear. Every vampire who acknowledges her authority feeds her strength. Every human who fears the night adds to her power." "But something's changing," Morgan continued. "About 30 years ago, Mother started having episodes, moments where she'd forget who she was, where she'd see things that weren't there, where she'd lash out at enemies only she could perceive." "She's going mad," Lilith said quietly, slowly, inevitably. 3,000 years of existence pressing down on a mind that was never meant to carry that much time. She's starting to fragment, and when she breaks completely, every vampire dies with her, all of us, because we're all extensions of her power, echoes of her original curse. When she ends, we end. Keol felt his worldview shifting, pieces rearranging into new and troubling configurations. "And you ran because—"
"Because she wants to take us with her when she goes," Morgan said bluntly. "She's been obsessed with the idea of family lately. Keeps talking about how she won't let us face the cold alone, how we need to ascend together, how she'll make our deaths beautiful." Her voice cracked slightly. "She loves us. I think she genuinely loves us, but she's going to kill us, and she doesn't understand that we don't want to die." "We're children," Seraphine whispered. "In vampire years, we're babies. Morgan is barely 200. Lilith is 93. I'm the oldest at 312. We've barely experienced existence. We haven't seen the world, haven't found our purposes, haven't—" She stopped, composed herself. "We aren't ready to end, so we ran." "And Mother couldn't understand why," Lilith added. "To her, death is completion, the final movement of a symphony. She can't comprehend why we'd fear something so natural." Keol processed this, each revelation reshaping his understanding. "And then I appeared, human, armed, standing between you and your mother. She must have thought you were the most fascinating thing she'd encountered in centuries, a human protecting vampires, choosing their lives over his own, for no reason but their fear. She met his eyes. You confused her,
and confusion is the only thing that could have saved you. The door opened again. This time, it wasn't one of the princesses. A vampire entered, male, tall, dressed in formal attire that suggested court position. His face was carefully neutral, but Cale could see tension in every line of his body. "Lord Cale Thorne," he said, his voice carrying the formality of old aristocracy. "The Queen requests your presence, immediately." Morgan's hand went to her hip, where a weapon probably used to be. "He's still recovering. The Queen," the vampire repeated, "requests your presence immediately." It wasn't really a request. Cale pulled himself out of bed, ignoring the protest of half-healed injuries. "Take me to her." "Cale, no," Seraphine started. "I'll be fine." He had no idea if that was true, but saying it felt important. "I survived once, I can survive again." Lilith's ancient eyes held his. "No," she said softly. "You really can't. But you'll go anyway, won't you?" Cale managed something like a smile. "Seems like the pattern, yeah." The throne room was designed to make visitors feel small. That was Cale's first thought as he was led through corridors of impossible architecture, walls that curved in directions space shouldn't allow, ceilings that receded into darkness despite being indoors, floors that reflected light in ways that suggested depth and void and falling forever. The palace itself was ancient beyond reckoning, built in an era when vampires walked openly under blood-red skies and humanity huddled in caves, telling stories about the monsters that walked like gods. Every surface was carved with history, wars that predated recorded history, kingdoms that rose and fell before humans learned to write, the slow and terrible march of vampire supremacy over a world that had never stood a chance. And at the end of all those corridors, through doors that looked like they'd been carved from solidified night, was the throne room. It was vast, impossibly, unnecessarily vast. The ceiling soared hundreds of feet overhead, held up by columns that looked like they'd been grown rather than built. Black stone shot through with veins of crimson that pulsed like circulatory systems. The walls were lined with tapestries depicting the great moments of vampire history, each one telling stories of triumph and dominion and the inevitable victory of darkness over light. And at the far end, elevated on a dais that seemed less like architecture and more like a manifestation of hierarchy, was the throne. It wasn't a seat, it was a declaration of absolute power, forged from materials that shouldn't exist, metals that drank light, gems that contained the final moments of dying stars, wood from trees that grew in dimensions adjacent to reality. It towered overhead like an entity unto itself, suggesting that whoever sat in it wasn't really a person anymore, but an extension of sovereignty itself. And sitting in that throne, watching him approach with eyes that burned like the last fires at the end of time, was the Vampire Queen. She looked different than she had in the forest. Less aggressive, perhaps. The massive wings were folded against her back. The armor had been replaced with robes that looked like they'd been woven from midnight and morning. The crown on her brow seemed smaller, though no less imposing. But her eyes, those eyes were the same, ancient and terrible, and containing depths that suggested she'd seen the universe born and would watch it die. "Approach," she commanded, and her voice filled the throne room like water filling a drowning man's lungs. Cale approached. Each step echoed in the vastness, a tiny sound in an enormous space. He was aware of vampires lining the walls, courtiers, advisors, warriors, all watching him with expressions ranging from curiosity to contempt to hunger. He stopped at the base of the dais and, because he didn't know what else to do, met the Queen's gaze directly. A murmur ran through the assembled court. Apparently looking directly at the queen was either forbidden or suicidal, or both. The queen's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You don't bow." "Wasn't sure if I should." Wise answer. Bowing implies submission, and you are not mine to command. She leaned forward slightly, studying him the way a scholar might study an interesting manuscript. "My physicians tell me you should have died. The damage to your heart, your lungs, your skeletal structure. By all rights, you should be a corpse." Disappointed? Fascinated. The queen rose from her throne, and the act of standing seemed to reshape the room itself, dimensions adjusting to accommodate her presence. She descended the dais with movements that were almost hypnotic, each step carrying a weight that resonated in Cale's bones. She stopped directly in front of him, close enough that he could smell her, old books and funeral flowers, and something that might have been ozone, or might have been the scent of endings made manifest. "3 days ago," she said quietly, "you stood between me and my daughters. You knew you would die. You knew your weapon couldn't harm me. You knew there was no strategic value in your defiance. And yet, you stood."
"They were afraid," Cale said, echoing his words from the forest. "They are vampires. Fear is their birthright. We are the apex predators of reality itself. We should not know fear, should not experience it as anything but a tool to wield against lesser beings." The queen's eyes searched his face. "And yet, my daughters ran from me. They feared me, their own mother." For the first time, Cale heard something in her voice that wasn't power or dominion or the weight of millennia. He heard hurt. "You love them," he said slowly. The queen's expression hardened. "Love is a human concept, a chemical fiction your species invented to justify reproductive imperatives." "You love them," Cale repeated, "but you're willing to kill them." "I'm willing to take them with me into the dark," the queen corrected. "There is a difference. When I die, and I will die, small hero, even I am not immune to entropy. Every vampire in existence will follow, my daughters included. I am simply offering them the mercy of a beautiful ending, rather than the cold dissolution that awaits otherwise." "Have you asked them what they want?" The throne room went absolutely silent. The queen stared at him as if he'd spoken in a language she didn't recognize. "Asked them? Whether they want to die with you? Whether they'd prefer to try surviving whatever comes after you're gone? Whether they have any say in their own ending?" "I am their queen, their mother. I know what's best. Do you?" Cale interrupted, and several courtiers actually gasped. "Because from where I'm standing, you're making decisions for them without their input. You're assuming you know their desires without asking. He stopped himself, aware he was probably crossing a line that would get him killed. "I'm what?" The queen's voice was dangerously soft. Cale took a breath. In for a penny, in for a pound. "You're being a bad parent."
Then the queen threw back her head and laughed. It was the same sound he'd heard in the forest, mountains being born, tectonic plates grinding, the earth's crust cracking under unimaginable pressure. But this time there was something else mixed in with the terrible power. Something that might have been genuine amusement, or might have been the sound of someone hearing truth after 3,000 years of lies. "A bad parent," she repeated, wiping at her eyes. Did vampires cry? Apparently they did, because there were actually tears there, crimson drops that fell like rubies. "A bad parent," No one has dared speak to me with such insolence in 3,000 years. Should I apologize? No. The queen composed herself, though there was still amusement dancing in those burning eyes. No, you should not, because you're correct. She turned, began pacing, her robes trailing behind her like liquid shadow. I have existed for so long that I've forgotten what it means to be temporary, to be young, to be afraid of endings rather than welcoming them. She looked back at him. My daughters ran because they don't understand that death is mercy. They think they want to live, to experience more, to grow into their power. But they're too young to understand the weight of centuries, the crushing pressure of time, the way immortality slowly erodes everything that makes you, you. Maybe they are too young, Kale agreed. But that's their choice to make. You can't force wisdom on them by killing them. Then what would you have me do? The queen's voice carried actual frustration. Abandon them to fade into nothingness when I die? Let them dissolve like mist in morning sun? That's not mercy, that's cruelty. Or, Kale hesitated, aware he was about to suggest something that was either genius or insanity. Find a way to let them survive without you? The queen froze. Impossible. Is it? You said every vampire is descended from your blood, carries a fragment of your power. What if there was a way to anchor that power in something other than you, to create a new source they could draw from? There is no such source. I am the first vampire, the original curse. When I end, the curse ends. Curses can be transferred, transformed, anchor the new hosts. Kale was remembering half-forgotten lessons from Dominion weapons labs, research into vampire biology, attempts to understand and weaponize their power. The Dominion was researching it before the fall, ways to sever the connection between vampires and their progenitors. It was incomplete, but the theory was sound. Theory. Theory means nothing against 3,000 years of certainty. Then test it. Kael met her eyes. What do you have to lose? If it fails, you die as planned and take your daughters with you. But if it works, they survive. The queen was silent for a long moment, her expression unreadable. And what would you want in return for this miraculous solution? Because humans always want something. I want you to stop killing humans, Kael said flatly. The queen laughed again, shorter this time. Ha 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 ha, impossible. We are predators, you are prey. This is the natural order. Then make it unnatural. Evolve, adapt, find other sources of sustenance. The Dominion had experimental blood synthesizers that... You're asking me to change the fundamental nature of my species. I'm asking you to let your daughters live. Kale took a step closer, aware he was probably signing his death warrant, but unable to stop himself. You love them, I can see it. You terrify them, yes, but underneath that terror is the knowledge that you care. So prove it. Give them a chance. Help me help them survive. The queen studied him for what felt like an eternity. The entire court watched, silent, waiting for her judgment. Finally, she spoke. If I agree to this madness, and I have not agreed, I'm merely entertaining the hypothesis, what would you require? Access to Dominion research archives, what's left of them, equipment, time, and... Kale hesitated. Your daughter's cooperation. Would they participate?
They'd have to. If we're trying to anchor vampire power in something other than you, we need to understand how that power flows through them. Study their connection to you. It would be invasive. Research involving my daughters, conducted by a human, in order to save them from a death I decreed. The queen smiled,
and it was not a comforting expression. You realize how this sounds. Insane? Precisely. She was quiet for another long moment. Then, I accept your proposal. A collective intake of breath from the assembled court. On one condition, the Queen continued. You will remain here in the Eternal Throne for the duration of this research. You will be under constant surveillance. If I suspect, even for a moment, that you intend harm to my daughters, I will end you in ways that make our forest encounter look merciful. Do you understand? I understand. Then we have an accord. The Queen extended one hand, long fingers, crystalline claws. I am Morvana, Queen of all vampires, first of the night, sovereign of the Crimson Throne. And you, Cale Thorne, are either the savior of my line or the most elaborate fool I've encountered in 3 millennia. Cale took her hand. It was like grasping winter itself, cold that went deeper than temperature, absence of warmth on a molecular level. Let's hope for the former. Indeed, for both our sakes. The Dominion archives were kept in the palace's lowest levels, in chambers that had been carved from bedrock during the war when humanity still believed it could fight back. Cale descended into them with a guard of 7 vampires, 3 more than strictly necessary, which he took as either paranoia or respect, possibly both. The stairs spiraled down through layers of history, past foundations that dated back to when this place had been human, before the vampires claimed it and remade it into their seat of power.
The archives themselves were vast, an underground library that stretched further than Cale could see, lit by bioluminescent fungi that cast everything in shades of blue and green. Shelves towered overhead, packed with data crystals, printed documents, holographic storage matrices, everything humanity had managed to save before the fall. Most of it was military research, weapons, tactics, desperate attempts to find vampire weaknesses that could be exploited. Cale had clearance to access all of it. Queen Morvana had given her word, and apparently that still meant something even for the Sovereign of Night. But the material he needed was in a sealed section, marked with biohazard warnings and encrypted locks. The Dominion's vampire biology research, the project that had been running for 20 years before the fall, attempting to understand the fundamental nature of the vampire curse. Project Severing Dawn. Cale accessed the data with credentials he'd thought were long dead, surprised when they still worked. Apparently, the Dominion had planned for the possibility of surviving researchers needing access even after the fall. What he found was both more and less than he'd hoped. The research was brilliant. Teams of xenobiologists, mystic theorists, and weapons designers all working together to decode vampire existence. They'd made real progress, had actually succeeded in temporarily severing the connection between a vampire and their progenitor for brief periods. But the process was unstable, dangerous. 4 test subjects had died. The 5th had survived, but had gone mad, experiencing vampire existence without the anchoring connection to their bloodline source. The research had been shut down 3 months before the fall, deemed too risky, too prone to catastrophic failure. Cale spent 3 days reading everything, absorbing technical specifications and theoretical frameworks, cross-referencing with vampire mythology and biological samples the Dominion had collected over years of warfare.
The princesses visited him regularly. Seraphine came during what passed for daytime in the vampire court, sitting beside him and reading over his shoulder, asking questions about the research with a sharp intelligence that suggested she'd make a formidable scholar if given the chance. She told him stories about her mother,
Morvana before the madness started creeping in, when she'd been stern but fair, powerful but not cruel. She taught me to hunt, Seraphine said quietly, one afternoon while Kale was knee-deep in protein structure analyses. We weren't allowed to hunt humans until we came of age, but other creatures, things that lived in the spaces between worlds, beings that predated both our species. She was patient, kind. She'd demonstrate the proper technique, then watch me fail, then correct gently. Her crimson eyes held sadness deeper than her apparent years. I want her back, the mother she was before time started eating her from the inside. Morgan came at night, when the court was most active. She'd station herself near the entrance, ostensibly guarding, but actually watching Kale work with an intensity that suggested she was memorizing everything. Once he caught her reading a section he'd flagged as particularly important. "Interested?" he asked. "In understanding how you plan to save us? Yeah, I'm interested." She looked at him, and her expression was complex. "I don't trust you. You know that, right? You're human. We killed your species. You should hate us."
I did hate you, Kale admitted. For a long time. After my sister died, I spent years hunting vampires. Killed 17 before I found you and your sisters. And now? Now I think hate is exhausting. And you three are children who didn't ask to be born into a war they didn't start. He shrugged. Easier to just try to fix things. Morgan was quiet for a moment. Then, "Your sister, what was her name?" "Lyra." "Would she have approved of you helping us?" Kale thought about that. Lyra had been kind, had worked in medical research, had believed in finding solutions rather than just fighting endlessly. Yeah, she would have. Morgan nodded once, then returned to her post. But something in her posture had softened, just slightly. Lilith came rarely, but her visits were the most unsettling. She'd appear without warning, materializing from shadows with that eerie silence unique to the very old or very young. She didn't ask questions about the research. Instead, she'd study Kale himself, those layered eyes tracking his expressions, his movements, the patterns of his thought process. "You remind Mother of something," she said once, appearing behind him while he was reviewing genetic sequences. "I'm not sure what. But there is recognition in how she looks at you, like you're an echo of something she'd forgotten. Is that good or bad?"
I don't know yet. Lilith tilted her head in that inhuman way. But it's interesting. Mother hasn't been interested in anything but her own dissolution for decades. The fact that you've caught her attention suggests you're either very important or very dangerous. Or both? Or both, Lilith agreed and vanished back into the shadows. On the 7th day, Kyle thought he'd found it. The key wasn't in severing the connection between vampires and their progenitor. The Dominion had been thinking about it wrong. You couldn't cut that connection without killing the descendant vampire, because they were fundamentally dependent on the power flow from their bloodline source. But what if you didn't sever the connection? What if you transferred it? The research suggested that vampire power flowed like a circuit from progenitor to descendant, a constant stream of energy that sustained the curse. If Queen Morvana died, that circuit would break, the power would dissipate, and all vampires would fade. But circuits could be rewired. You didn't need the original source, you just needed a source, something that could generate and sustain that same power flow. The Dominion had been experimenting with synthetic progenitors, artificial sources of vampire power. The research had failed because they couldn't replicate the complexity of Morvana's curse. 3,000 years of accumulated power and mythology and fear made manifest. But they didn't need to replicate her entirely. They just needed something that could act as an anchor, a new hub the princess's power could flow through. And Kael thought he knew what that anchor could be. He called for an audience with Queen Morvana. "You want to use yourself as the anchor?" Queen Morvana's voice held a combination of disbelief and something that might have been amusement. They were in her private chambers, a space that was somehow both intimate and imposing. The walls were lined with artifacts from 3 millennia of existence, weapons from forgotten wars, crowns from kingdoms that no longer had names, artworks created by beings that had been extinct for centuries. Kael stood before her, surrounded by data crystals and holographic displays showing his research. Not exactly, but close. He activated a display showing the proposed ritual structure. The Dominion's research proved that vampire power can be temporarily anchored in living beings. They used captured vampires as test subjects, but the theory should work with humans too. We're biological, we have blood, we can serve as conduits. Humans who try to channel vampire power tend to die in extremely unpleasant ways, usually involving combustion from the inside out. Because they were trying to contain the full force of a vampire's power. I'm not proposing that. Kael zoomed in on a specific section of the ritual diagram. I'm proposing a distributed anchor. Your daughter's power doesn't flow through me. It flows through a modified version of the original vampire curse, which is anchored to me. I become the hub, but not the source. Their power circulates through the curse structure, which is tethered to my life force. Morvana leaned forward, studying the diagrams with an intensity that suggested she was actually taking this seriously. And when you die, the tether breaks and the power returns to looking for a source. But humans can live 70, 80 years naturally. That gives us time to find a permanent solution, to research ways to make your daughters fully independent, or to find a way to transfer the anchor to something more stable. Or to make you immortal, Morvana said quietly, because that's what you're really proposing, isn't it? Tether vampire power to your mortality, and suddenly there's enormous incentive to keep you alive indefinitely. Kael hadn't thought about it in those terms, but she was right. Is that a problem? It makes you the single most important human in existence. Every vampire in my line would be dependent on your continued survival. You'd have power over us. Her eyes glowed brighter. Why should I trust you with that power?
Because I don't want it. Kael met her gaze. I'm not doing this for power or leverage or anything except keeping 3 terrified children alive. If there was another way, I'd take it. But this is what I've got. So either we try it or we accept that your daughters die with you. Morvana was silent for a long time, her expression unreadable. Finally, she spoke. This ritual, it would require my direct participation. Yes, you're the original source. We need to trace the power flow from you to your daughters, then redirect it through the new curse structure. It'll be intense. Intense. A dark laugh. You're asking the queen of all vampires to rewrite the fundamental curse that created our species, while she's slowly going mad from the weight of 3,000 years of existence. What could possibly go wrong? Honestly, a lot. There's a significant chance the ritual fails and kills everyone involved, or succeeds and kills everyone involved, or partially succeeds and leaves your daughters in some horrific state between life and death. Kael paused. But there's also a chance it works, and that chance is better than certainty of death. Morvana stood, began pacing. My daughters, you would ask them to participate in this. They'd have to. We need their consent, their active participation in redirecting their power flow. I won't force this on them.
even though forcing it might give better chances of success? Even then, Kyle's voice was firm. They get a choice. That's the entire point. The Queen stopped pacing, turned to face him fully. You're an unusual human, Cale Thorne. Most of your kind would be trying to weaponize this knowledge, turn my daughters against me, use this as leverage to restore human dominion. Most of my kind are dead. The dominion is gone. The great human kingdoms are ash. We lost the war. All I'm trying to do now is prevent more unnecessary death. Even vampire death? Even vampire death. Morvana studied him for another long moment. Then she smiled, not the terrifying expression she'd shown in the forest, but something smaller, more genuine, almost sad. My husband would have liked you, she said quietly. Kyle blinked. You were married? 3,000 years ago, when I was young, and the world was still figuring out what vampires were. Her voice carried the weight of memory. He was human, a scholar. He believed vampires and humans could coexist, that we weren't natural enemies, but could learn from each other. She looked away. He died during the first purge, when the human kingdoms decided we were too dangerous to tolerate. I watched him burn, and something in me burned with him. After that, coexistence seemed like a beautiful lie.
I remember everything. That's part of the curse. Perfect memory. Every moment preserved in crystalline detail. 3,000 years of everything, pressing down on a mind that was never meant to hold that much experience. Morvana's hand trembled slightly. He would have helped your research, would have been fascinated by the idea of anchoring vampire power to human life, would have seen it as the bridge between our species he had always believed in. What was his name? Thiron. The name came out soft, almost reverent. And he would absolutely have liked you, because you're exactly the kind of foolish, brilliant, suicidal optimist he was. Cale didn't know what to say to that, so he just waited. Morvana collected herself, royal composure sliding back into place. Very well. We'll attempt your ritual. I'll speak with my daughters, explain the risks, obtain their consent. If, and only if, all three agree, we proceed. And if they don't, then we find another way. Her voice carried absolute finality. But we will find a way, because you're right. I am being a bad parent, and it's time I remembered what good parenthood looks like.
The princesses agreed. Not immediately. There was a long, intense conversation in Morvana's chambers that Cale wasn't privy to, raised voices and crying and long silences that spoke of difficult truths being confronted. But eventually, all three emerged with red eyes and determined expressions. "We'll do it," Seraphine announced. "All of us, whatever it takes." Morrigan nodded. "We're not ready to die. We want to see what comes next, even if it's dangerous." Lilith just looked at Cale with those ancient eyes. "You'll keep us safe?" "I'll try," Cale promised. "I'll give everything I have to make this work." "Then that's enough," Lilith said simply. They performed the ritual in the palace's deepest chamber, a space that existed at the convergence of three ley lines and had been used for vampire coronations and great workings since before human history began. The room was circular, carved from black stone that seemed to drink light. Symbols covered every surface, not carved, but grown, as if the stone itself had decided to express meaning through architecture. At the center was a ritual space, marked by circles within circles, each one inscribed with formulae that combined vampire glyphs and Dominion technical specifications. Kale had spent 2 weeks preparing, working with what remained of the palace's scholarly vampires to translate his research into actionable ritual components. It was half science, half mysticism, a hybrid approach that would have horrified purists from either discipline. But it might work.
The princesses took their positions at 3 points of the primary circle: Seraphine to the north, Morgan to the east, Lilith to the south. Each stood within their own sub-circle, surrounded by offerings, blood, synthesized, not human, grave flowers, crystals that resonated with vampire power frequencies. Queen Morvana stood at the western point, completing the cardinal square. She'd removed her crown, her armor, appeared in simple robes that somehow made her more imposing rather than less. Her wings were fully extended, each feather edge sharp enough to cut moonlight. And Kale stood at the center of everything, surrounded by technical equipment that looked profoundly out of place in the mystical setting. Biomonitors, energy field generators, devices designed to measure and redirect power flows that shouldn't exist. "Once we begin," Morvana said, her voice echoing in the chamber, "there can be no stopping. The ritual will run to completion, successfully or catastrophically. All of you understand this?" 3 voices responded in unison. "We understand." Kale Torn, you understand that this will fundamentally change you, that even if you survive, you will no longer be entirely human. "I understand," Kale said, and was surprised to find he meant it. "Then let us begin." Morvana began to sing. It wasn't anything like human music. The sound existed on multiple frequencies simultaneously, harmonics that resonated in bone and blood and the electromagnetic field surrounding human consciousness. It was the original vampire curse given voice, 3,000 years of accumulated power compressed into audible form. The princesses joined her, their younger voices weaving through Morvana's melody like threads through fabric. Seraphine's voice carried aristocratic precision. Morrigan's held military discipline. Lilith's contained depths that suggested she was older than her body implied. The circles began to glow. Not with light, exactly, with presence, as if reality itself was becoming more concentrated within the ritual space. The air thickened, became viscous, difficult to breathe. Kal-El activated the technical equipment. Energy field generators spun up, creating a lattice of force that overlaid the mystical circles. Biomonitors connected to his neural implant, feeding him real-time data on his body's response to the increasing power density. The singing grew louder. Power began to flow visibly now, streams of crimson energy moving from Morvana toward her daughters, the eternal current that had sustained them since birth. But instead of flowing directly, the energy began to curve, drawn toward the technical lattice Kal-El had created. This was the critical moment.
Kale reached out with his mind, not metaphorically, but literally, using Neuralink capabilities designed for weapon control, but repurposed for ritual work. He touched the flowing power, felt it sear across his consciousness like touching a live wire made of condensed time and hunger. And he pulled. The power flow redirected, curving through the technical lattice, through the modified curse structure he'd spent weeks designing. It poured into him, not into his body, but into the space his consciousness occupied, the metaphysical location where mind and reality intersected. It hurt. Not physical pain, though his body was definitely screaming. This was deeper, existential, the agony of having more power than you were meant to contain, forced into a vessel that wasn't designed to hold it. Kale screamed, but he didn't let go. The power continued to flow, Morvana's 3,000-year curse being filtered through human consciousness and technical infrastructure, emerging changed, restructured, still vampire power, but anchored to new metaphysical coordinates. The restructured power flowed outward from Kale toward the three princesses. He could feel them on the other end of the connection. Seraphine's desperate hope, Morgan's terrified determination, Lilith's ancient patience. The power reached them, connected, anchored.
For a moment, the ritual space was frozen in perfect balance, power flowing from Morvana through Kael to her daughters, a circuit completed, a new configuration of reality settling into place. Then Morvana stopped singing. The sudden silence was deafening. The power flow from her to Kael ceased abruptly, the connection severing with an almost audible snap. But the power flowing from Kael to the princesses continued, sustained by the curse structure he'd created, drawing on his life force instead of their mother's. The ritual was complete. Kael collapsed. He woke 3 days later for the second time since entering the palace. This time all three princesses were there, sitting around his bed, watching him with expressions that mixed relief and worry and something that might have been awe. "It worked," Seraphine whispered when his eyes opened. "Kael, it actually worked. We can feel it. The power flow. It's different, but it's there. We're alive. We're alive." Morgren was trying not to cry and failing. "You absolute idiot! You're glorious, insane, beautiful idiot! You actually did it!" Lilith said nothing, but her ancient eyes held something that might have been gratitude or might have been recognition of a debt too large to ever repay.
Kale tried to sit up, found his body responding sluggishly. Everything felt different, heavier, like his mass had increased without his dimensions changing. His senses were sharper, too. He could hear heartbeats, multiple heartbeats, throughout the palace. Could smell blood moving through veins. "What happened to me?" he asked. "You became a bridge," said Queen Morvana's voice from the doorway. She entered, moving with that same impossible grace, but something about her seemed lighter, less oppressed by the weight of millennia. "You neither human nor vampire, but something between. A new thing, the first of your kind." "Am I—" Kale hesitated. "Immortal now?" "No." Morvana sat on the edge of his bed, a gesture that seemed oddly intimate for the queen of all vampires. "You still age, still die, but your lifespan has been extended significantly. The curse structure you're anchoring requires you to survive, so it's actively maintaining your biology. I estimate you have several centuries before natural death becomes a concern." "Centuries," Kael repeated numbly. "Which gives us time to find a permanent solution, to research ways to make my daughters independent, or to make your anchor transferable, or—" Morvana paused, "to simply let you live, because that's the other thing we discovered during the ritual."
What? The curse recognized you, accepted you, not as a temporary host or emergency measure, but as worthy. She leaned closer. "Do you understand what that means? The original vampire curse, which I created 3,000 years ago out of pain and rage and the desire to survive, looked at you and decided you were an acceptable anchor. That's never happened before. The curse has only ever recognized me." "So what does that make me?" "Family," Seraphine said quietly. "The curse recognized you as family, as kin, as someone who would protect us the way Mother would." "You're our father now," Lilith added, and there was no hesitation in her voice, no doubt. "Not biologically, but in every way that matters. You protect us, sustain us, give us life. That makes you family." Kale looked at the three of them. Seraphine with her silver hair and desperate hope, Morrigan with her military bearing barely containing overwhelming emotion, Lilith with her ancient eyes holding newfound warmth. Then he looked at Morvana, expecting anger or jealousy or resentment at being supplanted. Instead, she was smiling. "Good," she said simply. "They need a father figure, someone who isn't slowly dissolving into madness, someone who can guide them through the centuries to come." She stood, placed one hand on Cale's shoulder. "I'm still their mother, still their queen, but I'm failing Cale Thorne. Failing them, failing my species, failing everything I built. So I'm asking you, begging you, to be what I can no longer be, to protect them when I'm gone, to give them the future I couldn't." Cale looked at the four of them, 3 vampire princesses and their ancient, powerful, broken mother, and felt something shift in his chest. Not the power flow, though he could feel that constant now, a river of energy moving through him toward the girls. Something deeper, something like purpose. "I will," he promised. "For however long I last, I'll protect them, guide them, help them become whatever they're meant to become." "Thank you," Morvana whispered, and he realized those were the first words of pure gratitude he'd ever heard from her.
6 months later, Cale stood in the palace's observation tower, watching the sun rise. He could do that now, tolerate sunlight, though it was uncomfortable. The cursed bridge he'd become gave him some vampire characteristics, but not the full vulnerability. He existed in a strange middle ground, not quite human, not quite vampire, something unprecedented in 3 millennia of conflict. Behind him, he heard footsteps. 3 steps, familiar now. "Morning, Dad," Morrigan said, and the words still made something warm unfold in his chest. "Morning." He turned, smiled at them. They'd grown more confident over the past months, less afraid, starting to explore the palace and their own capabilities with actual enthusiasm instead of terror. Seraphine was reading again, some ancient text about vampire history. Morrigan had taken to training in the palace's combat halls, working on techniques that combined vampire power with human tactical thinking. Lilith was studying everything, absorbing knowledge like a sponge, asking questions that suggested she'd be terrifyingly brilliant given enough time. They were growing, learning, living. "Mother wants to see you. She's in her chambers."
Cale nodded. He visited Morvana regularly now, checking on her, talking about the progress he was making in researching permanent solutions for the princess's survival. But also just talking about her husband, Theron, about the early days of vampire civilization, about the burden of perfect memory and the weight of centuries. She was fading, slowly but noticeably. The madness was progressing, moments of confusion becoming more frequent, but she was also at peace, knowing her daughters would survive, would have a chance to become whatever they wanted to become. "I'll go see her," Cale said. Then to the girls, "What are you 3 doing today?" "Research," Seraphine said. "I'm helping with your work on permanent anchor solutions." "Training," Morrigan added, "and maybe hunting. There's a dimensional rift that's been spawning hostile entities. Thought we'd deal with it." "Learning," Lilith said simply. "Everything, always." Cale smiled. "Be safe, all of you." "Always, Dad," they chorused, and headed off to their respective activities. Cale watched them go, these 3 vampire princesses he'd somehow become responsible for. These children who'd been terrified and running and were now finding their strength. Then he turned and headed toward Morvana's chambers, toward whatever conversation awaited. The future was uncertain. The research was incomplete. His new existence as Curse Bridge was still being figured out. There were 1,000 problems still to solve. But they were alive, all of them. And that was enough. For now, that was enough.